Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 24th chapter of the book of Job. The theme of theodicy is the genre of Job, and the theodicy theme asks the question, why do the righteous suffer? And in this chapter, Job turns the question on its head. He asks, why don't the wicked suffer? Why is there no immediate retribution why are some people able to get away with fleecing the poor their entire lives with no punishment and no retribution? These are the questions he asks. This is connected to Job's 8th speech, which begins in the 23rd chapter, and we're going to review with three of the things he said to. This is in response to Eliphaz the Temanite, his third and final response or speech. And then after this, by round 3, this is the third round, he just gets all personal and says, you are this, you are that, you are everything, you're what's wrong with you, essentially. And he just completely ignores him, and he focuses his testimony on in his answer and response on Elohim. He does not seek restoration of his material properties or children. That's what he gets in the end. What he seeks above all else is vindication. He wants to be declared that he did not sin in the presence of divinity. Of course, if only I knew where to find him, I would come to his dwelling. So he was seeking and he was not finding. He was knocking and no one was opening. He was speaking and no one was listening. He felt alienated and estranged from the one he sought, the one to give him the explanation and to vindicate him and to declare him innocent of any sin, but he just couldn't find it. And he is transcendent, but he is also immanent. He combines this. Transcendent is the attribute of being above and beyond us. Immanent is the intimate presence and manifestation. He is both of these things, and because he is transcendent, he is beyond our reach, beyond our grasp. But he does visit us in immanent form, and he does speak to us through our pains. So one of the things we learn from the book of Job that Elihu gives the young one who we hear of after the Bildad's 5-verse chapter, the second speech, that's round 3. Then Job speaks for a chunk of chapters. Then we hear from Elihu, and what I forgot what he was saying, so I'm just going to move on. I would present my case before him and fill my mouth with proofs. So he's presumptuous and confident in his ability. In the 9th chapter, he confesses his inadequacy quite correctly in hindsight, as revealed to the answering of this request. Yahweh does descend in the whirlwind and meet and condescend to speak to him, and he does vindicate him over his friends. He just argues from the vantage point of might is right, but that's neither here nor there. I don't want to get distracted as I was with the other laneish thought. We're just going to keep this going. I would know the words which he would answer me and understand what he would say to me. So that's a pretty bold claim to have, to be able to intuit the mind and the words and the machinations, to be able to predict divinity, who is completely sovereign and perfectly capable, and often does upset our most cherished designs and desires. But Job, when he does condescend to him in the positive theological term, that just means condescend, come down to. So it is an act of condescension for the one who's from heaven to come to earth. But when he does come, Job is silenced, and he can only speak of his own insignificance before him. Verse 10, for he knows the way that I take. When he has tried me, I would come forth as gold. So Job has come to an awareness by this point. He's convinced that he's being tried, he's being tested. But in the temptation and test and division of labor that's established in the first 2 chapters, the heavenly dialogue, which none of Job or his friends are privy to. But the testing was the reason that he was suffering, and Yahweh is sovereign, and he is the devil is a tool and a pawn at his disposal. And so he allowed Satan to take precisely as much as Job could endure. And even though Job survives and is exemplified as a model of patience by the New Testament author James in the 5th chapter, 11th verse, of the book which bears his name, he was understandably impatient at time, but he had faith that he would be refined through the vindication process to suffer without having sinned and to not have sinned while he suffered. But of course, Job did not suffer because he sinned, but he did sin in his suffering. On a few occasions, he is guilty of the sin of self-righteousness. It's a fine balancing act in Job's case, certainly. Verse 12, I have not strayed from the commandments of his lips. I have treasured the words of his mouth more than my portion. This speaks volumes about Job's priorities, Job's desires, Job drives. He was spiritually in tune. He was a spiritual person, and the definition of a spiritual person is one who feeds the spiritual element in them and it takes only secondarily concern of our physical appearance or health, or our spiritual health is more important than our physical health. But it's not unrighteous of us to cling on to the health and the life we have. But man shall not live by bread alone. Portion is most familiarly translated as daily bread. But in Deuteronomy 8:3 we read that man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of Yahweh. Verse 15, therefore I am troubled at his presence. I consider, I am afraid of him. So earlier in the chapter, he speaks of his whether he looks to the left or the right or the east or the west, north or south, up or down, whatever the translation is. He is unable to find him, but he is troubled at his presence because, as he makes known in the previous two verses to this, he uses the pronoun that indicates that ascribes personal blame to Job's present predicament. So he is troubled at his presence. He feels that he is present, that he is the author of his evil, because in his mind there is, strangely, Satan is absent in his theology. 24th chapter, first verse, lesson itself. Times are not hidden from El Shaddai, and why do those who know him see his days? Why have not those who know him see his days? So another way to rephrase the question in a way that might make more sense is, why are the wicked unpunished? And why does not El Shaddai, who is so just and so righteous, just intervene with all this injustice that is going on the earth? And the answer is because he is sovereign. He is not obligated to intervene in the natural exchange of the human agency that he provides. And as I explained in a recent lesson I did on Romans 9, there is no contradiction between human agency and divine sovereignty. But we don't want to go there. But, the question of why are some people, he goes through the sins of the country, then moves on to the sins of the city in his dialogue. And everywhere he looks now as a citizen of Uts, he would have been prominent in the city, but he also had an agrarian he had livestock and cattle and everything else, so he was familiar with both things. And the first 11 verses he denounces, he says that the ones who commit the sins in the country seem to get away with it. Verses 12 through 17, he lists the cities of the sin. So we don't know how far we'll get, but that's just what lays ahead. They remove landmarks. They rob and feed on flocks. This was a very serious crime, according to Deuteronomy 28:19 or somewhere thereabouts, or the 19th chapter. I forget which one. But the landmarks, now the ancients, it was unusual to build a physical wall around one's property, but there were recognized boundaries that coexisted between neighbors of adjoining properties, and that line was sacrosanct and to be preserved and maintained uncorrupted, and the practice of moving it was made slightly more possible by the absence of physical walls and barriers between the properties. But to remove it would have been stealing. You are stealing from your neighbor. You are not loving your neighbor if you steal him. So if the sum of the law is is formulated in a love of thy neighbor. If you're stealing from your neighbor, your literal next door neighbor, you are not embodying that principle. They drive away the donkey of the fatherless. They take the widow's ox as a pledge. So one of the things I might have mentioned was that Job lived in pre-law times. The book of Job is the chronologically earliest contribution to the Old Testament. It was believed to be dated in the patriarchal era. This is pre-Moses. Job had no Genesis. He had no word, but what he did have was a relationship and faith in the Almighty. He makes himself known and has made himself known through other ways before the Bible. And but, the Mosaic Law, which this points ahead to, has a concern for the orphans and the widows, the fatherless. These are the most vulnerable of society, and the exploitability was a constant temptation for those who had the resources to squash them out, the resources to enrich themselves at their expense. And this was a despicable practice, but one that went on nonetheless. Donkeys and ox would have been possessions of widows and orphans who were just trying to eke out a living. So to take one from such a one would be just beyond despicable. They turn the needy out of the way. The poor of the earth have hidden together. So their attitude towards poor people is make them poorer, do not make them richer. If they come begging for alms, just get them out of there. They keep, stay away from me, you thieves. You are trying to take what I earned, which I really stole from you. So they're getting their ill-gotten gain can compel one to not, if there's not going to be a selfless motive in ill-gotten gain. So, of course, you're going to despise and dismiss the poor the ones who are most needy. You're just going to despise and dismiss them. See, as wild donkeys in the wilderness, they go about their task, eager seekers for prey. The desert gives his bread for the children. While wild donkey, that image is likened to Ishmael in Genesis 16:12. He is the elder half-brother of Isaac, the seed of promise. He is the father of the Arab people and the Muslim who founded the Muslim religion, and everything we need to know about him and his progeny is contained in Genesis 16:12, which compares him to a wild ass, and his hand will always be against his neighbors, and his wherever he is, he'll be against all. He will be a wild donkey. The term wild donkey was not a flattering designation or appellation in civilized society. The wild donkey was the untamable beast, subjected to its own carnal appetites, just going about to and fro, causing nothing but mayhem. And that is how Job compares the rapacious rich who fleece the poor because they can. They see something, they don't have the resources to hold the property that was their inheritance, so they swallow it up and then send them out to the wilderness, the desert, where they have to eke out their bread. So you're sending them away from food, security, and civilization. They reap his fodder in a field, and they glean the vineyard of the wicked. So to reap where one does not sow is a crime of all crimes, according to the principle of he who shall not work shall not eat. But to glean would have been, this practice would have been legally permitted by the Mosaic Law. Remember, Job is before the law, but a lot of these principles that Job espouses are consistent, and his three comforters are consistent with the principles as espoused in books such as Deuteronomy and Proverbs. Much of Job's friends' theology is consistent within those frameworks. But according to the book of Deuteronomy, one could a passerby, a stranger, could pass by. They just couldn't have containers to extract more than their present needs. So this kept a lot of poor people alive, the practice of gleaning, of passing through because remember, there were no walls in ordinary property. So the poor people could march over on richer people who didn't have walls. They spend the night naked, without a garment, and without covering in the cold. So the they is the widows and orphans that the rapacious rich, the wicked fleecers of the country who take advantage of those who are vulnerable and exploit them because they can, and send them to sleep the night naked without a home, without any shelter. So to sleep naked would be physically impossible because you are not warm enough to be in the state of sleep. And without covering in the cold, you'll die out there without clothing. Clothing is essential. So there was a practice of taking the tunics of as a pledge for a debt in the ancient world. They are wet with the showers of the hills and have embraced a rock for lack of shelter. So they're really just trying to eke out a living, scratch out a living any way they can, wherever they can. They are in a lifeless environment. They are still in the desert, but they can seek shelter from rocks there, but they don't have a home with walls or wood or stone or straw mat roofs or anything else. They are living under a rock in the desert, and they have no means to dry themselves off because first off, they don't have any clothes to begin with, and they're eking out a living in a rock where that is their source of shelter, not a home. They snatch away the fatherless from the breast and take a pledge from the poor. So there is that item of affectionate concern for Yahweh that is seemingly absent in the affection of the wicked, the fatherless, the orphans, the poor, the most vulnerable of society, and they is the wicked. So they snatch the they of verses 6 through 8. And to take a pledge from the poor would have been something to signal to satisfy a debt. So one of the ways a man would often be forced or compelled to pledge his tunic, and if you didn't have a reserved tunic, then you would walk away from court naked and destitute, and so it may have been more common than we may imagine in the ancient world. Naked they shall go about without a garment, and hungry they shall take away sheaves. Now if you rob a man of his last tunic, he will have no choice but to be naked and remain naked until the kindness of a stranger lends at least a cloth to him for him to cover him. But just to be reduced to nakedness would have been the crime of all crimes, and it would have been reserved for criminals who committed the crime of all crimes and just didn't have the resources to get away with it. But hunger is a basic physical satisfaction. Now, we still have to long for our daily bread. We should not look to live a day without our daily bread, but far less should we seek to live without a day of the word that Job treasured above his daily bread. Verse 11, they press out oil within their walls, wine presses they shall tread, yet suffer thirst. So all their energies and all their efforts will be to no avail and to no outcome and to no satisfaction, because they are the victims of an oppressive people who sort of live in the proximity. These are the destitute among the poor population and the rural agrarian era. And remember, Job has the vantage point from both, because as a citizen of Uz, he would have sat at the city gate. People would have respected his counsel. They would have listened to him. He would have settled and arbitrated disputes. But there is a significantly higher crime rate in the city. Cities are much more dangerous, and I think we have enough time to take the lesson to the end. Verse 12, men groan in the city, and the beings of the wounded cry out, and Eloah does not regard it as foolish. So the city, the people, cities are some of the saddest places on earth, and there's just a loneliness, even though you are surrounded by people. Cities are some of the loneliest places on earth, and cities are more conducive to sin than people breathing the clean country air. Nevertheless, a lot more people were agrarian in the ancient world, so this practice, the wickedness, would have been on the farms, and it perhaps still is. I'm not personally or intimately familiar with agrarian life in 20th or 21st century America. But why does Elohim not regard it as foolish when they are groaning is the question he wants to ask, and there are no easy or immediate answers to that question. They have become rebels against the light. They have not known his ways, nor remain in his path. So they are where they are because they are what they are. They are rebels, and they resist the light, which provides them guidance and directions and perspective and hope and illumination and enlightenment and just the vision to see the race and see the obstacles and to trudge on ahead to the end of the destination. And the journey is often more meaningful than the destination. But if you are a rebel, you're not even gonna be on the right path. You're not gonna know his ways. His will is not gonna be a concern for you. You will be your own almighty self. You will worship at the beck and call of you. The murderer rises at daylight. At daylight, he slays the poor and the needy, and in the night he is a thief. So most of the crimes in the ancient world, and perhaps even in the modern, would have taken place in the cover of night, because the shadow of the lack of light of the day provides the criminals, and the fact that less people are walking about to and fro provides the criminal with the darkness, because to get away with crime, the object of any crime is to get away with it, and it's a lot easier to to get away with crime in the cover of dark. So murderers, you're not going to murder someone in broad daylight in front of a city full of witnesses. And if you are a thief, far more to be, at least in the ancient world, operate and move under the cloak and cover of darkness. And the eyes of the adulterer watches for dusk, saying, "No one sees me," and he puts a covering on the face. Adultery and sexual sin in general is rampant, far more rampant in the cities than it is in the clean country air. But the specific sexual sin of adultery, now why would an adulterer bask, with his adulterous liaison in the light of day when he could do so in the night? So remember, sinners and criminals gravitate towards the dark because it provides them with the cloak with which they can get away, because the object of crime is to get away with it. So if you're flouting about your adulterous liaisons in public and just going everywhere about to and fro with them, then you're not going to get away with it. But if you do what you do in the cover of darkness and no one else sees you, then you are able to get away with it. And this is not to discourage, or encourage the practice of adultery. It is only to say that if you do indulge, it is to your advantage to be discreet. In the dark he has broken into houses. By day they shut themselves up. They have not known light. So the sinner seeks to and gravitates the darkness, because the same light which illuminates the wise blinds the wicked. Their spiritual eyes and antennas are not attuned or aligned to the sight, and they retreat to the darkness. This much is communicated in the New Testament, John 3:19, 21, and the familiarity. This also, we're running short on time, but we are tempted to launch a semi-discourse on Plato's allegory of the cave, but you can figure that out for yourself. For all them mourning is the same as the shadow of death, when he discerns the extreme fears of the shadow of death. Extreme fear is the shadow of death. Death is a fear. It is a natural trap of humanity. Death is the place no one wants to go, no one wants to live, no one wants to be. So it is a source of extreme fear. Yet again, according to some polls, public speaking is even more feared by more people than even death. So they'd rather die than get out in public and just speak what's on their heart and on their mind, or even a script they appeared. Just doing it in public is a source of extreme fear for a lot of people. But the way you overcome that fear is just by being prepared. Preparation alleviates nervousness. And we're going to wrap up this lesson today. We want to give the remaining verses the due deference, but the good news is that Bildad the Shuhite's 25th verse chapter is only 6 verses, so we'll probably end up combining that and this. That's all the time we have for right now. Thank you so much for being here. So glad to see you. Take care until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.